Welcome to the 5th tutorial in programming in Unity. But the next thing we're going to learn is how to dynamically drop sprites in our world. So in our Fruit Ninja game, we're going to have lots of different fruit items, I guess, that are going to just appear and jump up into the scene. So open up your game script. So at the top here, under score, I'm going to create an array of sprites. How do I do this? Well, I'm going to make this public because we need to access it back in our Unity world. We need to set the sprites to it. So, and now when I click on Game Handler, you'll be able to see here in our script, in our inspector, there's an attribute called Food Sprites, and that's our array. We're going to give it a size of 5, so I'm going to say it's going to have 5 different sprites in, and then I'm going to go back to here, drag some of these sprites into the empty slots here. So I'm going to put create a function which we're going to call to loop around these sprites. And then I use the curly brackets to indicate the start and end of the function. And then I'm going to take this food sprites array and I'm going to use a for each loop to loop around the food sprites array, and we're going to add them into the scene. And then we're going to say in which array we're going to search the food sprites array. And then you use brackets to indicate opening and closing. So the next thing we've got to do is we've got to create a game object. You remember when we added a sprite to the world here, we right clicked and we created an empty object, or we created a 2D object. Well, these are game objects and you can also do it in code. This game object is going to be called food. Call it whatever you want. And then you have brackets, and there's a couple of things we need to pass in as parameters in these brackets, and what we need to pass in is a name for our food. So I'll just call it item. It doesn't really matter. And then we have to tell Unity what type of, using the keyword type of, we have to tell it what type of game object we're trying to create. Type of, and then brackets again, and then sprite renderer. So now that's going to create a new game object in our world of type sprite renderer, but it's not going to show anything, so we need to assign this game object a sprite. So how do we do that? We type the word food, or the name of our game object food, and then you press dot, and then we have to go get component. Get component is a command to get a component of a game object. So if we click on this game object here that we created before and we look in the inspector down the side, you can see it's got lots of components. We've got a sprite renderer, a transform, a rigid body. Well, we want to get the sprite renderer game component. I can just copy and paste this. I'm going to put sprite renderer in here, and then I have to use brackets like that, and then I have to write sprite because we wanted to set the sprite of the sprite renderer to be our current sprite that we're looping through, or that we're getting out of the array. So we use the assign. So now I'm setting the sprite of our components sprite renderer to be equal to one of the items in our array, either the bananas or the marble, and it's going to add them into the world. To make the sprites appear in the world, this function is never going to get called unless we call it, of course, and a good place to call it is from our start function. So we write spawn sprites here, and I run it again. We should see some extra sprites drawn into our world, but they're very big and they don't do anything. So the first thing we're going to have to solve about this is our scale. Now you remember here when our bananas were too big when we dropped into the world, we came over to the scale attributes here and we changed the x and the y. Well, we can also do that in code. We write food.transform.local scale. This is interesting, and it matches up directly in Unity, because if you look at the game object in Unity, you can see that it has, in the inspector, it has a component called transform, and then transform has another property called scale. So if we want to get to the scale, we have to go game object bananas dot transform dot scale, and that's how we can change the scale in our game world. And then if I hovered over that local scale, it gives us some information about it. It says that local scale is something called a vector 3. So you can only assign an object with the type that it is. So we have to create a vector 3, and a vector 3 is basically a point in 3D space. Remember I said in the first tutorial that in 3D games, or in any game, you have like an X here, a Y, and then a Z. And it's the same, so that's what a vector 3 is. We have to specify what that vector 3 is, and then it will resize it. The other problem here is these numbers that we're meant to pass into here are floats. So I had to add F in front of it to indicate that this number is a float. If I don't add F, then the computer thinks that it's a double. And the next thing I want to do is we want to get the game objects bananas.transform.position, and we're going to maybe position it a little bit higher up. I'm not sure where I should position it, but these bananas, if you look at the position of it in the game world, it's at, let's put it at x0 and then y2. I still think the scale is a little bit too big, so we're going to reduce the scale a little bit more and put it to 0.2, 0.2. You might have also noticed in our game world that the objects don't have any physics, they were just hanging in space. Well, we can fix this. And we can add a component in code. You remember here when we wanted to give this bananas physics, we selected it, we went to the inspector, and then we clicked on add component, and then we looked up box collider and we added it on, so it had a box collider here, and then we did the same for rigid body, so it had a weight in the world. Well, we can do the same in code, and you get the game one, which you write dot and then you write add component, and then in these angular brackets you've got to write what thing that you want to add. We're going to write food.addComponent box collider 2D. So now we've set all those things in the code. We've created a game object. We've set the sprite of the game object to our current sprite from our array. We've transformed the scale of it so it's smaller. We've changed the position of it, and then we've given it some physics so it will drop. All these objects that we're spawning in this for loop appear and drop into the world. We're going to add a key press in here. So every time player presses a key, it's going to call the same function, and it's going to loop through and create loads and loads of game objects. So it's pointless putting a key detection there because it only gets called once at the start. So unless you press it right at the very start and you're lucky at the right moment, it's never going to detect the key press. But the update function is called once every 60 seconds. So this would be a good place to put the check to see if there was a key press. So how do we detect the key press? Well, we need to write a conditional. So we write if, and then we use a special class called input.getKey, and then we open brackets, and then in here we write the key that we want to detect. Key code and then maybe space. So if I do it like this, I don't remember all the different key codes, but I can just write the name of the key that I want to press, and it will kind of come up with it, and that's really helpful, you know. So I think when we press the space bar, I'm going to call this spawn sprites method. So I'll remove it from here, I'll cut it out, and I'll place it here, and then I save that. Now I'm pressing the space bar, and you can see it's generating loads of different sprites. And you see down here in the hierarchy, it's created all these sprites here, and it's given the name that we gave it when we created the sprite item. So basically we're dynamically creating lots and lots and lots of sprites without having to add them in our game world before, which you could just never do with this many objects. So that's how you dynamically add sprites using a for loop. So what have we learned in this lesson? Well, we've learned that you can also have arrays of objects or complicated objects like sprites, not just simple things like numbers or strings, but you can have any data type you like in an array. And in terms of games, this is very useful because you might want to have an array of sprites of different game characters that you want to appear. We've also learned a little bit about how the game loop works. So the start is called once, update is called once every frame. So if you want to check something during the life cycle of the game, you want to put that in update. And we wanted to check here if someone has pressed the spacebar. So we've also learned how to detect a key, and you write input.getKey, and then in the brackets you write key code, and then you basically type the name of the key that you want to detect, space, and then in this if statement, so if this condition is true, if we have pressed space, it will call our spawn sprites methods. So then we've learned how we can loop through our sprites array, and then how we can create a game object in code. how we can set the game object's sprite, how we can transform that game object's scale so it's a bit smaller, and how we can transform its position by accessing its permit position. And then we've also learned we can add any component we like, such as physics, to our game object, to give it a rigid body so it falls, and a box glider so it will collide with the floor and it won't just fall away, and also with each other. So in the next tutorial we're going to talk a bit more about functions and parameters. You've seen some parameters here when we're creating game objects, so hopefully if I talk about parameters and functions it will make it a bit more clear what you're doing here.